march which led them to Yan'an. A long march which is regarded today as a heroic march, but actually it was the march of the defeated. They were lost. They had lost the war, and they had to run away. And the long march was their way of running to a better place to defend themselves again. So it was in that situation that the Communist Party kept on saying, fight now, don't be such cowards. And that call became louder and louder, and the voices of nationalism rose to a pitch, and Chiang Kai-shek knew he was losing support every day. And there was a famous case, I can go into so many stories, but I better cut down. I think I got to watch the clock. There was the Xi'an incident, for example, which was a good example where Chiang Kai-shek was actually caught by one of the military warlords, Marshal Zhang Xueliang, the Manchurian general who lost his empire to the Japanese, caught hold of Chiang Kai-shek and threatened to kill him unless he went to war with Japan. And it was in that context, in 1936, when he was released, he had to release to sign an agreement that he will fight the Japanese, the first thing first opportunity he had. All this in the background. So when the Lugo Chao, the Marco Polo incident took place and shots were fired, Chiang Kai-shek could no longer stop his people from fighting the Japanese, even though he knew even then it was certain defeat. And the only way he could fight was to pull back, retreat. And while they did put up a heroic struggle for several months in Shanghai, after that, it was really, the game was over. They pulled back from Nanjing, they pulled back all the way to Chongqing. Now, that's the way the story went, and I'm not going to go into that now. But the main things I want to make, the points I want to make would be, first of all, the contrast between the first and the second. This was a strong Japan and a very, very weak China. Today, the conditions are obviously quite different. We have now a strong Japan economically and a rising China. Strong in some ways, but not that strong. But so let us say, if we roughly say, they are now comparable, much more comparable than they have ever been. And in fact, if you contrast it with 1894, probably there's some basis for comparison. There were miscalculations about who was more powerful, but as I mentioned earlier on, everybody thought that China was much more powerful than Japan in 1894, and were terribly surprised when the Japanese defeated the Chinese in so humiliating a way. That was totally unexpected. In 1937, it's totally opposite. But today, the position is really somewhat comparable to 1894. The two countries have certain comparabilities in strength. But in military terms, I would say there's no way of determining who is more powerful. On the surface, I would say the Japanese military forces are better trained, better armed, and more modern in equipment. And the Chinese one is still growing, large in numbers, but they've got a much bigger area to cover. And they are disadvantaged by the fact that they really have enemies all around them, whereas Japan has none. I mean, Japan's only possible threat is coming from China. Or they always mention North Korea, but that's not really serious. But it is really China. It is really China that the Japanese see as a potential threat to them one day. Whereas China has enemies all around. Their armed forces have to be spread over a very large area. The boundaries of China, the land boundaries alone, are thousands of miles. The sea boundaries are also thousands of miles. And what they have as a military force to deal with all that is really very flimsy, in my view. I mean, there's nothing comparable to what the United States has or to what Japan has, in terms of what Japan has to do for Japan and what the Chinese PLA has to do for China. I would say, in my view, I would say the Japanese have a clear edge over the Japanese in military terms. But let me take that aside, put that aside and say, let me look at what comments can one make about the fact by comparing these two wars. I'll try and briefly sum it up this way. First of all, both sides need to want a war to have another war. I don't think that is the case. and I think my two previous speakers would agree, neither side wants a war. If both sides want a war, or even one side wants a war, then war is inevitable. There's nothing you can stop that. But when both sides don't want a war, then we have to look at other reasons why they might or might not end up with a war. Secondly, another factor, all through both the earlier two wars as well, there were always other players involved. I mentioned that earlier on. I think it is still true today. In today's case, the main player involved would be United States. And it is quite clear to me that the United States doesn't want a war. So the third player doesn't want a war. And I think Dr. Koga was quite right to say that the US-Japan alliance could be a deterrence, and it's helpful up to a point. The fact is that that deterrence not only deters Japan and China, it also deters the United States, because the United States will want to make sure to use the alliance as a means of ensuring peace in the area, if they think it is in their interest. So there's a third player involved. There's also a fourth player involved. We keep on forgetting about it because it's a very small country, South Korea. Just now I said North Korea is not to be taken that seriously, although it is supposed to have some atom bombs. But I think that's not a serious issue, frankly, if it's a really serious war. But the South Korea issue is a much more complicated one. It has very special relations with the United States. It has a very special relationship with Japan itself, and is now developing a special relationship with China. In between all the three major players, it can play an important role in ensuring that there be peace around them. It is in their interest not to have any war in their neighborhood. In the background, there is Russia. I'm not sure what Russia can or cannot do, but I think it would be a mistake to neglect the Russian position altogether. It has vital interests in the Far East, vital interests in the Korean Peninsula, and also interests in its relations with Japan and China. So there are many other elements which we cannot take into account. I would simply assume, I would take as, at least for our purposes, that they will not directly intervene or contribute towards tensions in the area, that they will all try to work to prevent war. But nevertheless, by having more than two sides, we cannot afford to simply look at the two alone. We must watch their relationship with the others at the same time. Third point to make from both the wars is that sometimes wars can lead to real victory and someone benefits enormously. Clearly, the first war between China and Japan, Japan was not only the victor at war, it was a victor in almost every respect. It won a fantastic amount of money from the Chinese as a compensation for the war, which helped the modernization of Japan considerably. In fact, one calculation suggests that what the Chinese paid for having started the war, according to the treaty, that they paid the Japanese for the cost of the war, and that amount of war was actually several times larger than the budget of Japan, and the total budget of Japan. That was how it was calculated at the time. But whatever the calculations, there's no question that the amount of money that the Japanese got from the Chinese helped the Japanese modernize even faster and become more powerful. So the Japanese didn't only win a lot of Chinese to go to Japan to study and how to become powerful, they actually physically contributed money to that process. So all these things are part of the past, which are but important to bear in mind. The second one, however, showed that war would lead to losses on both sides. The Sino-Japanese War, although fought clearly with a superior Japanese army, led to great losses for the Japanese as well as for the Chinese. Far more for the Chinese than the Japanese, of course, but if you take in terms of the ratio of population, I think it hurt the Japanese almost as much as it hurt the Chinese. And once you take the Pacific War into account, then of course the Japanese lost tremendously. And it cannot be denied that the Sino-Japanese War contributed to the Pacific War, so that it was part and parcel of the same war extended when the Japanese maybe miscalculated and took on the United States. But I would have to say that The next one, if it comes, if there's going to